3, 2, 1. Pastor Tim, God bless. All right. Why don't you tell us about when did the Lord put it on your heart to start a brand new church, and maybe you could just give us a little intro to how the Lord started Bricktown Gospel Fellowship.
Sure. Well, to begin with, and without making it a long story, but just know that we are transplants from California. And so when we started in New York in 1996, we were coming to a different culture. And so it was an interesting experience for Pauline and I and the kids, to come out here as West Coast people. And so we settled into New City Gospel, where I had been called to like an assistant pastor assignment after graduating Bible college. And so that was full-time, and that was my first full-time ministry assignment. So we served there with Pastor Carl for 6 years. The church was about 400 or 500 people, a couple of services, booming and growing. It was a good experience, a good positive experience. Pastor Carl and the leadership there had a long-time vision to plant a daughter church. I think the vision really started with Pastor Carl. It was in his heart. And it hadn't happened for a long time. It was just something that he carried with him until the time was right. And so when the time was right, it was about the year 2000 when it was presented to the congregation as something that we would like to do at this time. And it just became a congregational, meetings, kind of a move in the congregation, suggestions from the leadership, let's do this now. And as Pastor Carl was considering who to have do it, I kind of surfaced as the candidate that he preferred because of my inner city background. And coming to, actually we didn't know when the idea was fresh about a church plant where we would wind up at. So first there was me and the idea of having a church plant before we knew it was going to be Haverstraw. But when it became apparent that it was Haverstraw, then it just seemed like a great fit because Haverstraw was known in the newspapers for drugs and crime, and people were afraid to be in downtown Haverstraw. But for Pauline and I, it was like being at home in our old city. And so we pulled the trigger on that. The congregation voted, and we wound up moving to Haverstraw, bought a home here with the church's help, lived up on Hudson Avenue where we raised our kids. They went to North Rockland High School. And we were meeting in my living room without public worship services. I had a home office. I was full-time. I was still considered an employee of Grace Point, just here on assignment. And we held home Bible studies for a year, had about 25 people, and made some converts with that. And then the time came to find a venue to have public worship services, and we wound up at Terrace on the Hudson. So we rented that. It was interesting. We had to pay $300 a month, or $300 a week every Sunday morning to have a 3-hour service there. And we had to rent 2 mini storages. No, I correct that. It was 1 mini storage, but 2 mini vans. So every Sunday morning, 52 weeks a year, in the snow and everything, 2 volunteers, each with a minivan, would go to the mini storage a mile away, load it up with all our sound equipment, schlep it over to Terrace on the Hudson, set it up an hour before service, have the service, and then be rushed out because they have other events, tear it all down, and the same volunteers run it back over to the mini storage and load it in, and then we paid $300 a week to do that. We did that for 5 years. And so it was good. We had 300 in attendance on our grand opening, which was a lot of well-wishers from the mother church and everything. What I was waiting to see was how many will we have on the second week. So it was about half that, 145, something like that. And then, so we had 5 years there. During that time, we rented commercial office space downtown here on Main Street. So we were upstairs from the Soupstone Cafe for a couple of years. Was funny because I would go downstairs for lunch and coffee, and they had muffins and everything. And I was known as the man upstairs. So we moved our Bible studies to there. We had hired a secretary to work in the office part-time. I worked there full-time, and I was able to be in the village and on the street and become a face on the street. Village Hall knew me very well. They knew that I think I might have been the only pastor that was working full-time in the ministry in Haverstraw, because I was out there while other people were working and no pastor was on the street like I was, so it was very different. We just got involved with civic things and outreach in the neighborhood. We found better rent up the street. We moved from Main Street up to New Main Street. We rented one floor of a building up there on the corner for a couple of years. We started out as Bricktown Gospel Fellowship. After 1 year or so, we incorporated as Bricktown Gospel Fellowship, Bricktown being a nickname for the village due to its brick-making history. And so that was one thing. And then this building became available when the Haverstraw Church, it was called, closed.
And what year was that?
About 2005, when we became aware of the building. So we kind of went into prayer as a congregation, thinking that how nice it would be to not be limited by the banquet hall, to not have children's ministry due to lack of rooms on Sunday morning, not have midweek stuff, no key to the building, you know. So we thought it'd be nice to be here, have fellowship hall, have weddings, have baptisms, leave the sound equipment set up, all these luxuries. The other good things came with it. We started a lot of ministries in-house when we moved here. That was about 2006. So we pastored this church for 10 years up until 2012. At some point, 2007, 2008, I started taking some missions trips. Went to India for 3 weeks, traveled the country, got an invitation to Ecuador, went and visited there, and really bonded and connected with a particular pastor and congregation in the capital city of Quito. And so in subsequent years, I made other trips there with a work team to help that church in Ecuador. What wound up happening was I met a lot of missionaries and people serving in Ecuador, and then I would come home and I would watch their websites and follow them. And as I did that, what evolved was my body is here in New York, but my heart is there. And that happened. And then I wanted to know if that was just my flesh or if that was really God's leading. Pauline and I took the better part of 5 years to pray and seek the Lord and to just try and know for sure that God was leading us to Ecuador and it wasn't just us just wanting to leave busyness here or whatever the case might be. So at the end of those 5 years, I remember it was January 2012. And I was reflecting on the past year and looking forward to the coming year. In my quiet time at home one day in January, and I heard the voice of the Lord clearly speak to me and say, Tim, if you and Pauline do not transition the church this year to the new pastor, you will be in disobedience. And what I should explain is I had a whole list of concerns. I had a dozen things on a list that I felt should be addressed, that I should have answers to before we went to Ecuador. We just didn't want to leave the church in a lurch. We didn't want to leave in any kind of a bad way. We wanted to do it right. And so I was concerned about my children and about my home and my jobs and my debt and different obligations that I had. And the Lord just answered all of those questions over about 5 years. And at the end of the 5th year is when he said, did you think that that wasn't me answering all of those questions and that I'm not in this? If you don't transition to the new pastor, because that was the last thing on the list that needed to be done before we could go, because all of the other questions were answered. So here we were standing there not moving ahead with that, and the Lord was just very direct with me and said, you need to get it to that level and to that point. And so you don't have to tell me twice. Something like that. So we came to the church board and told them we would be going to Ecuador. We told the congregation that at the end of 2012, we will be going to Ecuador whether or not we find another pastor, because we're going to take a year and hopefully that'll be enough time, but we're not going to be in disobedience and not go at that point. And we interviewed 2 other candidates before we found Pastor Elias and Jenny in the Bronx. And they wound up here by the end of November, I think it was, and we took off 1st of December. And so we were gone in Ecuador for 4 years before we came home to the States. And then after that, we wanted to go home and reconnect in California with relatives. And we were there for the previous 5 years. COVID hit, And Paulina and I found ourselves very inactive with no ministry during COVID. And so we started, for church, on Sunday mornings, we would watch the Bricktown live stream. Guess what happened over about 6 months? My body's in California, my heart's in Haverstraw. So it occurred to us to reach out to Pastor Elias and see if there would be a place for us at Bricktown if we could come back and worship here. And here we are, thank God. We're looking forward to what the coming decade will bring, and it's just a pleasure to be back working shoulder to shoulder with all of you.